Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this week's Inspiring Leadership podcast. And I've already been having a fascinating conversation with our guest, Lieutenant General Tom Copinger-Symes, CBE. And Tom is the Deputy Commander of UK Strategic Command. It's fascinating having a serving officer who's working in all three services and with the civil service on areas like cyber and SF and data and AI. And working with some really interesting people. He was talking about the value of gamers and how now we need to control drones and bits of tech kit. My son-in-law, who I always wondered what he was doing late at night into the early hours gaming with his friends, that's actually a valuable resource that we really need more than ever now, because compared to an artillery round, the death and destruction wrought by some of the drones, as we're seeing in the Ukraine, is far more effective and pinpoint accuracy. So fascinating time. But Tom, welcome to the Inspiring Leadership podcast.
Thanks, Jonathan. Privilege.
And you've, as you are always a man to planning and preparation prevents particularly poor performance. You've listened to a few of the podcasts. What have you sort of picked up as you've listened to your peers on the podcast and some of the things they've been sharing?
Well, the first thing I'd say is that they don't tend to be my peers. They seem to be very senior and very accomplished individuals. And I mean, you've done an amazing job of persuading some really, really notable people to come and chat. But also the variety. I mean, Neil Bezu is somebody I worked with years ago when I was the Army's operations officer, and so we were looking at national resilience and so on. And he was then still in the police, and just fascinating listening to his story and the variety. And so much of it resonates with your life in defence, and then there's so much difference too. So no variety, but seniority. So it's people always say it's humbling to appear on these things, but it really is humbling to be included.
For me, it's humbling having you on. And what's lovely is I'm writing at the moment my third book, which is called The CEO's Compass, Navigating Teams Through Turbulent Times. That's a lovely little tongue twister, navigating teams through turbulent times. But you'll be in that. And what's so lovely is, of course, you'll be proud of me. I'm using AI to take all 350 podcasts and making use of Google LM Notes and Sonics and Riverside, the one we're recording on now, to get the transcripts and put it all in one repository and then ask it various great questions. So I've got my own framework for the storyums and my leadership lessons using the Inspiring Leadership Compass with some of the questions I'm going to be asking you. But people's stories are what fascinates me. And AI picking out some of the best quotes and the best tips. I think it'll be great fun. And I'm also probably going to create a 365 days of top tips from leaders like you. So people can pick one a day. Because I think it is the people around us that inspire us, and we learn from them, both what to do and what not to do. And you've had some really interesting people, which we'll talk about in a minute. But first, tell us a bit about the actual job that you and the team are doing, and how it adds to defense of the nation and the interesting things that you're dabbling in at the moment.
Great. Well, thanks. So I'm in UK Strategic Command. So that's sort of not the Army, not the Navy, not the Air Force, but sits across them all, enabling and supporting them all. And we do sort of three big things in pursuit of defence's purpose. And defence's purpose, summed up by this new government as being more secure at home and stronger abroad. So that's our purpose. It's a defense level thing. We're not a separate institution like the Army, Navy, and Air Force. And we do three big things. So we do sort of support to operations and what we sometimes call campaigning. But so our single large, what the Americans could call a component command, a competent command. The permanent joint headquarters, the big bunker in Northwood, if you like, that was built after the Falklands War on the sort of lessons of lack of jointery, the lack of ability to work across the Army, Navy, and Air Force, sits within Strategic Command and is a really important sort of tool for doing our business across the world. So that's an obvious thing, but we also have, if you like, our overseas bases, so places like Cyprus or indeed the Falklands or Gibraltar. Sit inside the Strategic Command, and for instance, our defence attachés around the world all report into Strategic Command. So that sort of support to operations, the sort of global business that we're engaged in every day of the week, whether it's supporting the Ukrainians or indeed, working on the other side of the world with US partners or Five Eyes partners, engaging with NATO, in Estonia on the front line of NATO. We do that sort of support to operations. That's very clear. That's very explicable. Sort of everybody understands that and expect defence to be doing that. The other two are less simple to explain, but equally important. The second thing, therefore, is what we call driving integration. So there is that process of working across not just the Army, Navy, Air Force now, but what we call the 5 domains. This is sort of strange language to some people, but land, air, maritime, space, and cyber. And our job is to be the connective tissue across those 5 domains, but also then beyond defence, out with government departments, obviously particularly the intelligence agencies, with our allies and partners around the world. And increasingly now thinking about integration with industry and wider bits of sort of critical national infrastructure. Certainly the lessons from Ukraine and elsewhere tell you that if there's any gap between you and your supply chain, it's going to get exploited. So that's the sort of driving integration bit. And the last bit, which I'm sure you want to talk about later, is sort of leading, again, what we call the cyber domain, or the cyber and electromagnetic domain. So the unseen, largely man-made battle space, in which, largely misunderstood, in which the first shots of any conflict are now fired, and probably the last shots too. And where we're in contact with our adversaries literally every hour of every day in a way that's very hard for people to comprehend, because they're so used to sort of the physical domains where it's obvious if a plane's flying overhead or a ship's in the Irish Sea, we can see it and know it, whereas the online battle is happening every second of every day. So those are the 3 big things we do.
Well, thank you. It is fascinating to hear how that's been integrated, and of course, it's always work in progress. It can always be improved. But I know it's very common for people now to slag off the United Kingdom and say, "Oh, we're a mid-sized power now." But actually, from your perspective, I still think, do we not have quite a standing? I know we're a much smaller Army, Navy, Air Force than when I was there in 1982. I think the Army was 163,000. It's now 75. The Navy was 73,000. Now 32. The RAF was 92,000. It's now 30,000. Accepting all that's happened, I still think we have a very key role to play. And we are not just a mid-size. We actually, Europe looks to us for our armed forces, does it not?
Well, I think we got a very important role to play, and whether we're mid-sized, large size, or small sized, I think one of the amazing things about the 21st century is size is getting to be less important than speed in many ways. So I'm sure you want to come back to that, and the potential of autonomy and data and what we can do with that. But I think somebody said about NATO the other day, there are no longer large and small nations in NATO. There's just the quick and the slow. And there's a real value now in how you deliver effect around the world, whether that's sort of hard effect or soft effect. So I think we've got lots to be proud of there. And then again, the nature of our business is if you're too proud, you're just before a fall. So I think we should be staying humble too, and be thinking really carefully about how do we get better and better, because the world has changed around us. And armies, navies, air forces, defense organizations aren't always very good at changing at the speed of the rest of the world. So we've got to be on our learning edge there.
It's very true. And I will come, before we go on to talk about a few inspiring leaders, to the topic you were raising, which was sort of cyber communications, electronic warfare. One of my minor jobs, but it was very exciting, was as a troop commander in 14 EW Signal Regiment. And I sat on the East-West German border a lot of the time, or deployed and went escaping and invading because we were prone to capture, and the Special Forces trained us up. And I loved that job. And we reported back to GCHQ, which was very interesting. And I remember one particular dark night, we were creeping in with our vehicles with a little red torch, guided them into this Elbe feature, which was just near the border, and we're doing it without any bright lights or torches, guiding them all in. We put the vehicles together, we put the tent up, we got all our kit, listening in to the Russians, who at the time were in the East Germany on this big Magdeburg training area. They were doing a simulated fire mission for a whole division of artillery. And we'd been in there about 5 minutes, and the guys had the map, and the Russian map was different from the Western European map, and you have to adjust it with a special cursor, which would move it and make adjustment. And they slid the crosshairs over our location. And I went, guys, what's going on? They go, they're doing a practice fire mission of the whole artillery division on our location. But I said, well, we've been here for 5 minutes. They said, yeah. And they're just giving us the finger and going, we know where you are. And that was really salutary. And of course, often it was very interesting having the direction finding vehicles out and working out where they were, and they were working out where we were. And the final story before I come on to hear your latest on EW and cyber and things was on the East-West German border. I was with one of our vehicles, and we snuck into a wood, and we put up our mast, and we saw just about like 500 meters away on the other side of the East German border, their mast goes up, and then our mast goes up a section there, and then we started sort of through binos, waved at each other. But this game of cat and mouse, of course, is even more serious now than it was in the Cold War. And I just wonder what your thought is about EW, comms, cyber, and its importance these days.
Yeah, well, it's fundamental, and of course, the fact that you can't see it means that it is difficult for some people to comprehend. And I suppose the legacy of sort of communications and what we now call digital was always in a supporting role, and it still is a very important supporting role. But also, as I say now, it's actually the primary battle space every single day. And that's not just sort of intercepting data or stealing secrets or whatever else. It's also, as you know, seeing played out on social media every day. We're being actively bombarded with messages, and that's we is a very broad we. That's not just defense, that's our children, it's our parents and so on. And they're looking to influence not just what we think about, as soldiers or sailors or aviators, but also what we think about in the voting booth or in the rest of our lives. And that's a very active battle, if you like, that's going on, war that's going on, if you like, every day. So I think your appreciation of the sort of invisible world of EW is very, very useful these days. And some of it's online and some of it's offline. Your radio, sorry, your telephone, your mobile is a radio and a computer, and sometimes it's connected physically, and sometimes it's connected virtually. And it doesn't really matter. The data doesn't care. The data is just flowing, and whether it's online or offline, it doesn't really matter. So I think that's a really important world. It's quite a challenge to explain to people, and it's quite an adjustment for people to make to understand just how critical it is. But that's also a joy because it involves you with a whole range of new people. And you'll remember those soldiers from 14th Signal Regiment, the sharpest, brightest people. Some of them, the adjutant would remember, clever soldiers commit quite clever crimes too. There's just a certain sparkiness to them. They dream up new ways of getting in trouble, but just such a pleasure to have them. And I had 14th Signal Regiment under command twice as a brigade commander, as a division commander, and I loved going to visit them.
Yeah. Well, you remind me. I did an attachment to the Scots Guards just after the Falklands War, and I had a platoon, many of who'd been to war. And we were based in Cyprus and running up and down mountains and rehearsing the Falklands War with landing craft and all sorts of things, which, of course, is preparing for the last war rather than the next one. But that's another story in itself. But I remember, I'd say, right, guys, let's go and do this. Aye, sir. And we'd rush up this hill and there'd be lots of enthusiasm. And I went to 14 EW Signal Regiment. I had my troop, and, the most junior signalman, private soldier, had 2 degrees. One was in, Russian, and the other one was in, I don't know, equine herpes or something bizarre, a really, really strange 2nd degree, whatever it was. And I said, right, we're going to go and do this. And they go, well, actually, sir, have you thought about rather than doing this, we could actually go around this way and attack them from the rear. Guys, can you just do it? No, well, just before you do, there is another alternative. And actually, it was a good lesson for me that rather than just I have a monopoly for all the good ideas, I very quickly learned to go, okay, guys, this is the problem. Any ideas before we go forward? A bit like sort of going back to the wall when you were doing selection to be an officer at, in my days, it was Westbury. I'm not quite sure what it is now. But anyway, when they were doing officer selection, where the leaderless task. And just because you wear the rank of the leader doesn't mean you have all the best ideas. And that's a good lesson for us even today. I don't know what your thoughts are.
No, spot on. I mean, it's actually why I joined the Green Jackets at the end, because I did my due diligence. I visited a lot of amazing outfits, including in the Navy, technically the Royal Marines and so on. But when I got to the Green Jackets, you just had these slightly irreverent, gobby soldiers who were very happy to turn around to the young, as I was then, sort of potential officer, and right size them on on what was going on in the world and what my precious preconceptions about how to do something or what to think about something. And I love that sparkiness and I love that challenge from the start. And that's actually what first attracted me to them. And some of them didn't have degrees or A levels, or some of them didn't have O levels or GCOs and GCSEs in those days. But there was a sort of sparkiness and a streetwiseness, and just a different way of looking at things from you. That once you unleash that, it's just a magic potion, isn't it? So
yeah.
no, love it.
And even like you, probably a love of history and looking back at your origins for the Rifles. You were the CEO of the 5th Battalion, but the Royal Green Jackets, and reading about the Peninsular campaigns and how they were the sharpshooters and forward and thinking for themselves. And I think encouraging that in many organizations where people wrongly take this approach: if I want your opinion, I'll give it to you, shut up and listen to me. The leaders talk way too much. Many of the CEOs that I have the privilege of coaching have to be reminded time and again about, as soon as they open their mouth, they learn nothing new, but to really ask some great questions and to be really listening well and looking for people who might have unusual, quirky, different ideas and letting them flourish is what the Green Jackets, the Rifles, did and still do now. Talking of inspiring leaders at whatever level they're at, we were talking of Zach and of Charlie. Do you want to just tell us why you thought those two were pretty inspiring leaders?
Yeah, well, I mean, like anybody at sort of my stage in life in the military, I've worked for all of the great leaders, who have ended up as running the army or running defense or whatever. And it's a real privilege because you learn from them all. You also, from almost all of them, you learn a few things not to do as well. None of us is perfect, which I think is a change probably from when I joined the army. When I joined the army in the sort of late 80s, you could maintain a mask of command. You could control information to the extent that you could portray yourself as perfect and probably get away with it. Whereas one of the effects of sort of democratizing information, whatever the sensible way of saying that is, that I think everybody knows now our leaders are imperfect, and I think that's great. And I think this, one of the loveliest phrases I learned far too late was this idea of imperfect leader, complete team. Yeah, and so I've worked for all of them, but we were discussing earlier, this weird sort of world I've come into now of AI and data and cyber and so on, which was an interesting choice about 10 years ago and really wasn't very popular, or people thought I was a bit barking to go into that. And then some of the people I've had a privilege of working with. So Charlie Forte, who's the defense CIO, has been with us about 6 years now. Came in from BP, no previous in defence, tiny exposure to the public sector, but I've learned a huge amount from him because he looks at things very, very differently. Of course, lots of business knowledge, some of which is applicable and some of which isn't applicable in defence, but more than you think is going to be applicable. I mean, we're a lot more like a large organisation that large business organisation than we like to imagine. I think we tend to think we're 20% the same and 80% different. And in fact, I think we're probably 80% the same and 20% different. So I've found working for Charlie just hugely energizing and interesting because of the difference and just the different way he looks at things. So that's been good. Zach and I have been knocking around together since he was chief of staff, and he was James Bashel's chief of staff in Iraq when I was chief of staff in a battle group in Basra. And we had a very difficult, but as with all difficult tours, the most energizing tour that you could possibly have, amidst the misery, is just such professional satisfaction and challenge and excitement. And we worked very closely then and are working closely together now. So, it's one of the lovely things about the military, even when it was bigger, that you see people again and again through your career. And that cuts both ways, of course. But when you build these friendships and bonds, and the sort of trust that comes with it, it's lovely to be able to reignite them, and the understanding and trust that comes with it.
Yeah, and before we go and talk about some of the female leaders that you were mentioning to me earlier, who I'd like to hear about, I'm smiling and thinking when you're next with Charlie Forty and talking about his old organization BP. I'm listening to The Rest is Confidential. You've started listening to them, and they were talking about the early days of Iran and the MI6 CIA in the days when the CIA was about 2 years old. Coup to overthrow the I think it was the president or prime minister who'd nationalised British Petroleum's petroleum production because they sort of pumping it all back to feed the navy and didn't think that they ought to give some to Iran at all. And of course, you look back and you think, gosh, what have we done? When you look at these different countries now and our story and our place in Syria and all the rest and Israel, and you think, if only we were to know at the time the seeds we were sowing for problems that would come to bite us all many years later. So yes, you'll have to tease him about BP's part in what's going on with Iran today.
Well, I think Charlie would be quick to point out, although he's a bit older than me, he wasn't quite around in those days. But yeah, I mean, you can't live life, through the rearview mirror, can you? And no. I think we all make mistakes going forwards.
Oh, crikey.
But
I
you've got
lots.
to keep on making decisions. And
yeah.
No, he's been amazing, and he has, as you allude to, recruited this amazing series of leaders underneath him into defence, again, mainly from outside. The likes of Christine Maxwell, who's our sort of effectively our CISO, our cybersecurity lead, and Caroline Bellamy, our first chief data officer. I mean, imagine that defence, she is still our first and only chief data officer we've ever had in defence. Mivy James has just come in as our chief technology officer. And Claire Fry, who's a long-time civil servant who looks after our sort of functional and people and skills in digital. An amazingly strong team that he's brought in with him, who inspire me every day and challenge me every day. And it's been sort of such fun to learn at their knee, as it were, that they bring in skills from outside as well as from inside.
Yeah, well, thank you for that, Tom, and I look forward to having them as your recommended guests on the podcast in 25. But let's have a look at, as you and I said, we're fascinated by people's stories, and storytelling is a great skill. But there's much for us to learn from people's stories. So, what's your story, your origin story, as it were? Who's influenced you to make you the leader you are now as a Lieutenant General with the CBE, doing some fascinating work across the UK Strategic Command? Who shaped you? If Dad sounds interesting, your brothers sound interesting. What was the upbringing? What did you learn on the way? What mistakes did you make that have shaped you?
Yeah, so, a pretty military family, in that my father was a soldier. But by the time I came along, he was beyond sort of regimental duty. So you weren't in that sort of that very nested barracks environment. We were living abroad. I was born in Singapore, and then we went to Bermuda, in fact, which was a really tough place to grow up in the 70s. It was amazing. And then to Malaysia, in fact, for 5 years, and grew up in Kuala Lumpur, where he was working in the High Commission by then. So lots of military surrounds, but also quite a lot of, that was more of a diplomat's lifestyle then. A lot of international influences, but also just the joy of growing up, particularly in Singapore and Malaysia, amongst this amazingly vibrant culture. Of course, Malaysia then particularly different to how it is now. It's grown and developed hugely since then, as has Singapore. But that melting pot of different cultural influences, amazing food, needless to say, and just getting used to different lifestyles and different ways of thinking, I think is a real resource. And I'm sure there were downsides, and you came back to school, and you're away from your parents a lot, and so on. But I think that does shape you inevitably, hopefully mainly for the good. So, and of course, it's so easy when you focus on, what your dad did, to miss actually just the shaping that you get from your mother. And, actually, when I look back, when I look at what I'm trying to become as a leader, actually realize how much of the strength and the resilience and the sort of different way of looking at solving problems comes from your mother as well as your father, in a sort of classic, I'm a person of my age, growing up in the 70s, and how they both balance you. So easy to focus on the colonel who's the father. Easy to miss the amazingly resilient, strong woman who sort of went around the world, bringing up three obstreperous brats in my mother.
Yeah, but your brothers went on to do interesting things too. Your elder brother in the Royal Marines, and now Commando Spirit. He set up his whiskey company. And Jim, your other brother, who was Parachute Regiment Special Forces, and now running a private office. I mean, interesting brothers. I mean, you must have learned from both of them as much as they learned from you.
Well, I certainly learned from them. I'm not sure they would claim they've learned from me, but yeah, I mean, as the joke goes, Christmas must be fun in your house. The Marine, the Para, and the Rifleman. Yeah, no, I mean, we inevitably, when you live abroad as a family like that, you're pretty close. And then inevitably, when you're three brothers, you're pretty close, and it's pretty robust. And no, we learned an awful lot from each other. And then I think importantly went our own different ways. We all joined three different organizations within the military that are similar but very different. And that I think was the right answer, so we could all forge our own path. But then what's been lovely is sort of coming together at various times, militarily, where you cross paths. And I remember a particular time with my eldest brother, turning up at a meeting where they'd got his job title down, but my name down as a single person attending this meeting. They'd clearly thought there can't be two of them. And then we turned up in both and then behaved appallingly badly through the meeting because we were sort of 7 years old again. But it's such a joy when your sort of personal life and professional life collides in those things. So yeah, of course, a huge influence. And yeah.
No, it's very nice. And give us a bit of a flavour before you took over this role. What's just take us back through a few of the different titles for those who are in the military, or even just explain for those who are not in the military in the 125 different countries around the world, some of the kind of jobs and the things you've done.
Yeah, so the first sort of 2/3 of my career, very standard infantry career, really. So that, for those of you who don't know, that's work in a fairly small unit we call a battalion, up to sort of 500, 700 people, something like that. Going through the ranks as a young officer, leading a platoon, which is sort of 25 odd people, up to leading a battalion itself. And by the time I had 5 rifles and took them to Afghanistan, it was over 1,000 as a battle group. So, really quite a large organization there. But very close. That's a family. It's a big family, but it's a very tight family. And these amazing people who come and go in your life, particularly the sort of senior NCOs and the senior soldiers of the battalion, who you first meet as a fresh-faced, probably rather arrogant, brash little brat straight out of university. You might have met them while you were at university, and they filled you in around the back of the bike sheds on an exercise or whatever. But then you sort of go through life with them, and you knock around with them, and you knock the edges off them, and they knock the edges off you, and you develop these incredibly strong friendships between the sort of senior soldiers of the battalion and the officers' mess, and you know each other pretty well. And usually it's pretty harmonious, and sometimes it's not, but it all works very well together. So that's an amazingly sort of close, deliberately bonded organization, because that's where the rubber meets the road when you're at war. And whether it's Iraq or Afghanistan, or the sort of thing you're seeing in Ukraine at the moment, or in Gaza, at that level, distinctions between operations and war and so on are fairly moot, to be honest, because as soon as you're taking quite large numbers of casualties, that feels like pretty intense stuff. And when people look in and wonder about some of our curious traditions or things we do to bond teams together and wonder where they fit in, well, of course, they've evolved through hundreds of years to build teams really strong to withstand the rigors of what, and nobody is keener on a new way of fighting than me, with AI and cyber and everything else. But at the end of the day, war remains brutal, it's human, it's visceral, and teams need to be built really strong to deliver that sort of resilience and strength in the forge of war. And so that was the first 2/3 of my life.
And just staying with that, taking 1,000 people to Afghanistan as part of your battle group. This is for those listening, it's a collection of not just your own battalion, but you bring in all the support arms to allow you to be as independent as you can be and to deal with the threat. But, I'm listening back and having a number of people who've fought for Navy SEALs or Special Forces or infantry battalions in Afghanistan over that 20-year period. I was listening to, in The Rest is Confidential, the start of it all in 2001 with this sort of CIA group and guys riding on horses to try and take forts from the Taliban and Al-Qaeda and some of the horrendous things that went on. But watching the program Helmand about the Welsh Guards was salutary for a man who served in the military, albeit now well over 25 years ago. But it looked really hellish. And of course, I think back to my service with the 2nd Battalion Scots Guards, who'd been on Mount Tumbledown, while the Welsh Guards had also again had a hellish time on the Sir Galahad when it got hit by an Exocet missile and people were burning alive on a ship made of aluminium, which was melting around them and trying to escape from getting up the ladder while fire was burning around them. What was your own experience in Afghanistan like? I mean, I'm assuming you didn't bring all 1,000 back, that you would have had some injuries and some casualties.
I mean, I'm very proud to say we brought almost everybody back. But we did leave 2 on the battlefield. So that, in a counterinsurgency, and I remember an American friend of mine before I went saying, Tom, you can bring them all back. And I remember saying at the time, that's a hell of a lot of pressure to put on somebody. This was the time of, in the tri-boundary area in Nari Sraj, where we were, the previous tour, which was the Commando Brigade tour, it had very, very, very high levels of violence, literally every bit of armament being fired. And we went into what we were expecting to be a very, very difficult time. And then through some amazing leadership, really at company and platoon level, of people who were able to literally tilt their head on one side and look at the problem differently and work a way round the violence and really put the Afghan people at the heart of the plan, we were able to achieve amazing things and actually, clear that tri-boundary area with hardly a shot fired in the end. I know those are very loaded words, hardly a shot fired, but so I was really proud that we were able to actually do our job. And then actually, we were talking about Zach earlier. I handed over to Zach Stenning that battle grade AO as we left. But that was on the back of a very intense tour in Iraq that I alluded to when we were the last battle group left in Basra Palace. I was the chief of staff, where we'd had a really, really difficult time. And actually all of that's informed the third element of my career, which is, trying to work out how we use information better. But our first day in Iraq, first day in command of Iraq, having taken over from 2 rifles, we lost a good friend of mine before 11 o'clock in the day. We lost a civilian driver just slightly after that. So, and then the sort of descended from there, became a very, very.
It still is very raw for you, isn't it, Tom? I can see. It is. I just picked up. It's really hits you hard. You can't deny it.
I wouldn't want to deny it. I mean, these things are really, really important that you do feel, if you want to look after soldiers or sailors or aviators, you have to feel it. And if you don't, then that's going to be more difficult for you. When you stop feeling it, you want to start worrying.
Yeah.
And of course, at the time, you don't want to feel it too much because there's a job to be done. But if you don't go back afterwards and feel it, you're going to save up problems for later on.
Yeah.
So I think my approach in Afghanistan was very much informed by that. And, we had some really dark days in Iraq, which we then got through amazing leadership. The commanding officer at the time, Patrick, was really, really impressive at his ability to to recognize where we were in the battle and know whether to push on or pull back. So that was good, really good support from the echelons above and from the battle groups alongside, and just an amazing team of, Riflemen, Welshmen, and some Scotsmen in there too. And you mentioned the other people who make up a battle group, the artillery and the sappers and so on. Just a really, and in the times like that, you come together so strongly, and because it's sink or swim, you swim bloody hard together. And of course, in those dark, miserable days, they are also the most amazingly inspirational days of your life as well. And that's a weird alchemy that's very hard to explain to people who haven't lived it.
Yeah, and actually, with many listeners being CEOs of businesses or CIOs, CTOs, and all the kind of roles, you chief data officers and things like that you've been talking about. What's the lesson that you'd take? Because you're constantly thinking about from military to business and business to military. From those dark days with your battle group in Basra Palace and losing a really good friend of yours by midday, and working with all these different collections of people who are not yours. You're bringing them together from other organizations. There must be some good lessons there for a CEO running a business with a mixed bag.
Yeah, I mean, how long have we got? The reality is, so my job was, as the chief of staff, if you like, in inverted commas, to control the battle group so that the CO could command the battle group. Now, I know those are sort of loaded words and military words, but in simple terms, you're looking after the sort of business as usual so that the boss can command and be looking for the thing coming up, but also that they can smell. Literally in a battle, you feel the battle. That old German phrase, Fingerspitzgefühle, which people can Google later, but that sort of fingertip feel for the business, if you like. And I think, for a CEO, working out that relationship between you as the boss and your deputy, your chief of staff, your coup, however it's defined, people call it different things, and that share of business as usual and change, I think, is really important. And it's really difficult at the moment where we're all trying to transform, and judgments about whether the boss leads the transformation or whether the deputy leads the transformation are really profound. And, where I live in Stratcom although I've done a lot of transformation, it's my boss, Jim, who really leads the transformation because he knows we have to as Stratcom, we have to transform, we have to do that to make it better. And I look after business as usual more, although I hope I support him in transformation as well. Because if, transformation is so difficult, it's not just continuous change, it's not just continuous adaptation. You're really trying to do things differently, and that's got to be led from the top. So I think that in battle, that's exactly the same thing. He's relying on me and the chief of staff to keep things going, to run the plan. He's there seeing where the plan needs to change. And that's, you're getting a lot of data, some of it written down, some of it across the radio waves, but some of it you are literally smelling and feeling and sensing. And I'm sure that's the same whether you're an SME or running a FTSE 100 company or running a mom and pop startup. The range of data you're using to work out how to run the business, and then how you're changing it. I hope anyway that that's relevant to somebody.
It is, and you made me realize that this idea of having a great team of the talents, and particularly focusing on the areas that you should be focusing on, rather than a lot of the time when I have a CEO he and a colleague have perhaps founded a business, maybe a startup, which has then gone on to become a unicorn worth over a billion, and then NASDAQ listed, there is a temptation to think they've got to do it all themselves. They did as a startup, and it was all about them doing everything. And to try and get them away from being into everything, but actually trusting people. Otherwise, if you don't trust them, fire them. If you're doing their job for them, what are you paying them for? So having that team that you can trust is key. So no, many lessons in what you say. Let's do a quick whiz around the Inspiring Leadership Compass. If we're talking about the CEO's compass, this is it. Just some quick fire sort of lessons from you, or anecdotes or stories would be great. But begin with the true north, MQ, moral quotient. we now know that the latest research shows that magnetic north is moving from Canada towards Siberia at something like about 35 miles a year. It's moving a hell of a pace. So people who follow magnetic north are going to be sadly adrift compared to true north, which never changes. What did you learn when you let your values slip, and what would be your tip to others from your own experience?
So great question. I mean, I think I would just say that, and this is informed from the first 2/3 of my career, particularly being up close and personal with soldiers who didn't, as I say, necessarily have degrees or A levels. They sense you, they understand you in a way that, for those of us who are sort of degree educated and think everything's about an elegant phrase or a clever bit of writing, they know you, they sense you, they know what you're doing in a very visceral way. And you may think you've covered your lack of values or your moral ambiguity with an elegant phrase or a clever cover story, but they see right through it. And so when we talk about authenticity, or where we talk about relatability, all these sort of words that crowd the leadership and management space these days, it was just a really good reminder that you just can't bluff it. And we're all imperfect. We're all going to make mistakes. And the best thing you can do when you make a mistake, particularly when it involves trust, when it's moral, is to fess up as quickly as you can, not to your boss, but to your team, because they're going to know before the boss. And it's far more important that they know you've been straight with them, actually, than the boss knows you've been straight with them.
Great.
That's not a slur on any boss.
No,
it's just hard-won lessons from life. They know, they see it.
Oh, they can smell it. They can smell the bullshit. No, I think that's so true. And you talked about the mask of command. It's taken me in my 60s to do some very interesting development, to rip off the masks I learnt to put on at boarding school and at Sandhurst, to act in a certain way that I thought would get me through, but actually being much more authentic and being strong enough to be vulnerable and to admit when I got it wrong and it was my fault. That's lovely. Three questions. When was the last time you were dead wrong? Really worrying when someone goes, could have been 1972, but it wasn't really me, it was somebody else. That's a problem. The second one is, how quickly did you admit you were wrong? And thirdly, what do you do to rectify the situation? I think is really, really important. PQ, purpose quotient. What gives your life meaning and purpose, Tom?
So I don't have an amazing creation story about why I joined the military. Yes, I looked at other things, but really it was the family business. And I love this business. I love the purpose that comes with it. Both the sort of strategic bit, the secure the nation and make it stronger abroad, but also the sort of just working with soldiers, sailors, aviators, civil servants. I love that teamwork. And then, I mean, you mentioned earlier the sort of green jackets, now the rifles, of which I'm really proud to be the sort of colonel commandant, the sort of, the if you like, honorific figurehead. There's something in me that loves new things and innovation. And the combination of that sort of purpose, the team, the tight team, but also the ability to experiment, to try new things in delivering that purpose with that team, and unleashing that genius of those, curious, cunning, discombobulating, energetic, fierce, loyal, always getting you in trouble and themselves in trouble people. And I'm not just talking about riflemen here now. That's been a theme throughout my life. That is an amazingly intoxicating, heady mix of knowing that you belong to something bigger than yourself, that bigger than the team, but having the chance to build those teams, whether it's 10 people or 10,000 people, and then bringing new thinking, unleashing new thinking, because it always comes from below, really.
Yeah, I love it.
That's what does it for me.
Yeah, no, I love it. And you're thinking about the characters that we were with and the scrapes we got into. I was once appointed the officer in charge of showing good form, which often meant doing behaving badly, riding a motorbike through the officers' mess up and up the steps and things. And my sergeant major once said to me, when I was a very young officer, age 19, "Sir, you're always in the shit. It's just the depth that varies." Health quotient, HQ. Few leadership models, and you've studied hundreds, I'm sure, over the years, have health as a key component of leadership. But what's your tip about keeping yourself mentally and physically healthy that would help others listening?
Well, this isn't practical for everybody, but I can see your dog over your shoulder. Get a dog. I think both for your physical health and your mental health, certainly at our age, having a dog, somebody who's always pleased to see you, and somebody who gets you out in the morning and the evening and gets you at least breathing slightly heavily, going up a hill or chasing after them or whatever, is not practical for everybody. But if there's one tip I'd give senior leaders who can, and not everybody can, get a dog. I think the other thing, which is more about mental health, that anybody who's been under the sort of stresses and strains that we're all under these days in this sort of always on world we live in, I can't remember what you said. It was something about being strong enough to be vulnerable, being strong enough to know you need some help. That's really tough, particularly coming, from a military background where, certainly as I grew up, that wasn't the prevailing view. But knowing how to play that at the right time, at the right place, not all the time. There are absolutely times when I'm afraid, like it or not, people need a leader who seems to be impervious to the stresses and strains they're under and can show the way forward, that true north. But knowing when to find that time to fit your own gas mask or oxygen mask or whatever the phrase is, that's pretty important, because that stops you blowing up and that stops you breaking. And I think there's something that we've done through information, social media, the internet. COVID made it worse. We're not entirely in balance, and therefore finding balance for yourself, both physically, mentally, and emotionally, is, I would imagine, as relevant for CEOs around the world as it is for me or people various echelons below or above me.
Yeah, very true. And when I see CEOs come apart is when they haven't got balance. They've become workaholics, many of them. They think that's the only answer, is just to work harder and longer. And they've forgotten the partner. In many cases, it's a male CEO married with a female partner. But a number of the female CEOs I worked with, one or two, got terminal cancer because they'd been in very toxic situations for way too long, hostile takeover of the business or something like that. And they kept going, but they were under immense strain. And that level of the inflammation of the whole body, brain, body, and everything, will trigger. There is a connection. The body will respond to it. And in their case, one of them survived cancer, brain tumors, a number of them that had grown. The other one died of it. So there's some really serious things to it. And you reminded me of, we had Jason Fox, who's the TV personality Who Dares Wins with Middleton. And he was saying, looking back on his time in Special Forces, he didn't ask for help. He thought he just had to keep just working harder and just keep on, and no one talks about it. But I think you touched on a truism, which is, it's a fine line. There's moments when you just need the leader to be strong and not crumple. And there's other times when you need them to admit, I was wrong. And having General Sir Rupert Smith, which was fascinating. He was once, when he was the Deputy Supreme Allied Commander Europe, marvelous name, isn't it? D. Sacker. And he wandered in. They were giving a presentation. They were rehearsing it ready for him. And he came in and they said, General, what do you think to this problem? And he sat easily in a chair and put his boots up on the row in front of him. And he said, guys, I haven't got a clue. That's why I asked you to come up with a solution. Oh, we thought you had to have all the answers. And he goes, no, you don't have to have all the answers, but you have to have a good team. We'll help you have the answers.
So I think if I can, there's something there about asking questions. And spoiler alert, this is not me saying I know how to do this. I just observe that this is really important now. And I think, back in the 80s when I joined the army, the boss probably did have not only the most experience, but also had all the information and therefore was in a really good position to make decisions and to know the answer. And then as we've changed, as the internet's come along and data and information is far more widespread, I think the balance of leadership has fundamentally changed, and it is far more about asking questions. And you still get to be the boss, you still get to down select from the answers offered, and you still have to create the command culture or leadership culture that people genuinely offer up what might seem like a very strange solution to the problem. But I think there's something fundamental there about asking better questions. And it's funny, at the moment we're running a pilot for one of the AI tools, on our enterprise software, on our enterprise systems, and it's all about prompt queries. How to work with your AI agent. What question do you ask of the AI?
Oh, the quality of the question defines the quality of the answer.
100%. And why do we need to learn that from AI rather than knowing that from working with our human teams? There's just an interesting contrast there, but it's really making us all think, what's the prompt, what's the query? And I think we need to bring that back into our human interactions too.
Yes.
And just really think, how do you ask a question that gets the best out of the team, that doesn't close it down?
Yeah.
And, I'm as fond as anybody of trying to be the smartest person in the room. And sometimes that's the last thing you need to do as a leader.
Correct. You need to make the room smarter rather than be the smartest man in the room. And if you are the smartest man in the room, you're probably in the wrong room, as somebody once said. So I think you're touching beautifully on the combination of great listening skills, firstly, to then know the question to ask that is so open that they can go anywhere. And this is where the wonderful work of Nancy Klein, who was a great mentor to me, with time to think. And, literally when I'm with some CEOs, we often go on walks together, or I get them to go on a walk if they're another part of the country and I'm here, and they do their best thinking. And I often begin with, what do you want to think about? And what are your thoughts? And I do not assault their thinking. What do you want to think about? What are your thoughts? And they defrag the computer. They come up with all sorts of amazing results because they know I'm listening. Not only am I listening, but I'm then going to play back what I heard them say and what I heard them not say. So it's the gaps between the words. And I'm curious, you didn't say anything about this. Or when you talked about this, there was a pause. And then he said, I'm fine. I don't get that you're fine at all. Somatically, I'm not picking up you're fine at all. What's really going on for you? And that's very interesting. Sadly, time is coming to a close almost. Let me pick up, get viewer choice, I suppose. The question is, we could talk about emotional intelligence and listening well to others. We could talk about resilience. We could talk about personal brand or leaving a legacy. Which one would you pick? And we'll go with that one.
I think the EQ bit has been the most important thing I've learned through my leadership journey. It wasn't even a thing when I joined. I don't mean that it wasn't a thing. It just wasn't called that. And I didn't recognize that was a primary quality for any leader. It can be overdone. We still lead in complex circumstances where sometimes people really, really do just need a good old fashioned lead. But I think that ability to listen, as you were talking about oral listening there, I was thinking about now when so many meetings and things are done online, it's spotting the person who's gone off mute and then goes back on mute and goes off mute but never talks, and knowing to say, look, if you don't want to talk, just write something in the chat. We're listening with a whole bunch of different things than just our ears now. And that's really important. So I think learning what silence means. I'm not very good with silence. I like talking, but learning what silence means and what it doesn't mean is hugely important, and how it means very different things for very different people. So I think that's what I'd seize on, just because that's been the greatest challenge, but also one of the greatest joys of my own learning. Yeah,
it's lovely to hear that. And one tip that I was taught, which you may well use, is the simple skill of the use of thumbs. So people often go, okay, so we're going to take a 10% pay cut. All right. Yep. Good. Okay. No one said anything. Great. Fine. Let's move on to item number 2. Woo, woo, woo. People afterwards are having a bitch about it. So it's like, how committed are you? Are you a thumbs up? You're committed to that? Thumbs sideways? Not quite there. There's something just needs to be tweaked. Or thumbs down? You're completely again it. And to flush people out by a show of commitment through thumbs, it sounds very simple, but it's really useful, because then you know what will it take to make it a thumbs up. Now, you won't get everybody's a thumbs up, but at least, do you feel I've heard you? You're a thumbs down. Do you feel I've heard your point of view? Now go out and represent this as if it's a cabinet decision, as if it comes from you, not that Tom made me do this. It's a load of rubbish, because you're then ripping it apart. Disagree here. Don't be disagreeable, but disagree here. I really want you to disagree, but go out and represent as if it's from you.
And so this is, the challenge when we try and integrate defense, these amazingly powerful vertical silos that we built in the 20th century, because that was the best management technology there was. Getting things like the Army, Navy, Air Force working together across defense with intelligence agencies and so on, that's really important, because the consent and evade, the sort of passive aggressive, don't bring it in the room, leave, and then don't come together. You've got to flush that out somehow. And of course, there's always a sense of loss, and almost getting to the sense of loss is important, so that we can be honest. Okay, not everybody's winning individually, but we're all winning collectively. That's very hard to, I think the fancy word now would be to curate that meeting. But anyway, to bring that out is a real skill that, frankly, we're all learning. And wow, in the life I have, every day I'm learning something new, and that's a really difficult skill.
Yeah, and before we go into your top tip, which we'll end with now, I just picked up you say something, consent and evade. Is that a habit that some have? They consent, but they then evade doing anything about it or taking responsibility.
All large organisations have found ways to play the game in meetings and so on, and find elegant ways of agreeing to something, but then actually going around the corner and doing something else and flushing that out. I mean, you'll know because this is your business, but the sort of high performing teams aren't always harmonious in meetings. They can have very vigorous disagreements, but then agree. And that's, that is going back to battalion life that I spoke about earlier. My origins, we had very vigorous disagreements in groups, in orders groups, at the lunch table, at the dining table, but then we all agreed to be on the same team 5 minutes later, and that's a really important skill.
Fantastic. Well, there's so much more we could talk about, Tom, but if we now get you to introduce yourself, talk about the role you're doing now, a couple of the jobs you've done before, and leave us with your top tip. That'd be a nice way to wrap up.
Thanks, Jonathan. So my name's Lieutenant General Tom Copinger-Symes, and I've been a soldier for a shocking amount of decades now, most of it in a very conventional sort of sense, working in the British Army in the infantry, and leading fairly small teams. And then for the last 10 years or so, I've been really exploring how we use information and data to help us fight differently, but also run the business of the Army and Defence differently, which has taken me into a very different mix of teams and cultures and different workforce, as we'd say today. But there are many things that remain similar through those different phases of my career. And I suppose my top leadership tip would be something I learned probably about halfway through my career, which wasn't nearly early enough. And that's this lovely phrase that they won't really care how much you know until they know how much you care. And that ability to build trust in a team, upwards, sideways, downwards, is so important. And then if you do our sort of business, which does involve putting people in danger, once they know you care, there is then an absolute duty on you to make sure you know. That's not know everything, but to be relentless and restless in trying to improve yourself as a leader, or in my case as a soldier, or now in my new world, trying to understand what AI can do for us, or what cyber is, where quantum's going. And it's not about the technology, it's the potential of that technology to help us fight differently, operate differently, protect our nation differently, and make a stronger and look after our interests across the world in a different way. So if you care, they'll care. You'll build trust, and then you'll have the confidence to go where people haven't gone before and learn new things and think about new ways of delivering your purpose, which is a great combination for me.
Fantastic. Well, Tom, it's been really great having you on the Inspiring Leadership podcast. I knew it was going to be a good one, but you've exceeded my expectations. Thank you. Good luck with the work you're doing, and thank you for the service you do for our country, working with some talented people. And let's stay in touch. But thank you.
Thanks, Jonathan.